At 76, I didn't expect to outlive all my dogs. I certainly didn't expect a German Shepherd puppy to show up on my front step in Minneapolis, Minnesota. That day, I opened the door for mail and a gust of cold air wrapped around my knees. On the concrete sat a sagging cardboard box, damp along the seams like it had been waiting too long. The top wasn't buried in snow, but the flaps were soft under my fingers, and the air seeping out was colder than it should have been. I pulled them back and leaned closer. Curled inside was a trembling puppy in a thin blanket. His paws were too big, his ears were too big, and his dark eyes locked on mine like he was trying to decide if I meant trouble or rescue. He didn't whine or bark, he just watched, chest fluttering in quick, uneven breaths. At the bottom of the box lay a narrow scrap of paper. "I heard you never turned away a dog. Please, I can't keep him." I stayed there in the doorway, one hand on the knob and one on the cardboard while my chest tightened in that familiar clamp. There are pills on the counter for that, a knee that protests every step, and more little graves in the yard than I like to count. I had sworn I was done. No more leashes by the door, no more fresh holes in the ground. But this little guy stared up at me from that blanket like none of that mattered. "You picked the wrong old man, kid," I thought. A rusty laugh slipped out anyway, and the words followed right behind it. "You picked the wrong old man, kid?" I leaned my cane against the frame and reached into the box. My hand shook, from age or from something else I didn't want to name. He went still for a heartbeat, then that cold nose touched my fingers, warm breath puffed between us, and something in my quiet house shifted. I told myself he was staying for one night. The puppy had other plans. I was 76 and set in all my ways. This puppy didn't care about my ways. I slid the box inside with my foot and shut the door on the gray Minneapolis street. The little house felt even smaller with that damp cardboard sitting in the middle of my kitchen, under the yellow light, next to a table older than half the people on this block. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to count my heartbeats. I folded the flaps back and he blinked at me, that German Shepherd puppy, still wrapped in his thin blanket like he wasn't sure the deal was final. When I lifted him out, he was lighter than he looked, all bones and hope. The sound of his claws on the linoleum was the first new sound in that room in a long time. I went to the cupboard on habit more than anything and found an old metal bowl from the last dog I swore would be my last. Behind the flour and the canned soup sat a half-forgotten bag of kibble, stale around the edges, but still food. I didn't know why I'd kept it until that moment. He ate like the world might end before he finished, head buried in the bowl, shoulders shaking. Every few bites he'd stop and lift his eyes to me, just to make sure I was still there. Like I might vanish if he looked away too long. It's a strange thing, being watched like you're the only solid piece of furniture in someone's life. The smell of dry food and damp fur pulled me backward before I could stop it. Suddenly, I was 12 again, in my parents' yard in northern Minnesota, snowbanks taller than me, my first shepherd thundering through drifts while my father laughed from the back steps. I remember thinking dogs lived forever, and men were the ones who disappeared. By evening, the kitchen was warm from the oven and the little body at my feet. I dragged an old blanket into the front hall and spread it out by the door, telling him in my best firm voice that he would sleep there, just for tonight, so we wouldn't get too attached. He circled obediently, lay down, and set his head on his paws like he understood contracts. I turned off the lights and sat in my chair, the one spot in the house molded to my bones. After a while, I heard the soft, careful tap of claws, the kind that apologize with every step. He eased into the living room and curled up right against my chair leg, close enough that his warmth brushed my ankle. I looked down at him and an old name rose to my tongue, a ghost of another dog, another lifetime. I stopped it halfway out, swallowed hard. This little guy didn't have a name yet, didn't have a story with me yet, and still, somewhere under all my promises to keep my distance, a quiet, stubborn thought settled in. Maybe he wasn't just a guest for one night. I thought I was teaching a puppy to live in my house. Turns out, he was teaching me to leave it. The next morning, he was up before the sun, sitting by the door like he'd worked the night shift. In the pale winter light, he looked almost unreal. a white shepherd puppy with cream smudged along his ears and nose, like somebody had started to color him in and then got distracted. I dug out an old leash from the hall closet, the leather stiff and cracked from years of hanging there without a dog to claim it. He mouthed the clip, sneezed when it swung toward his face, and then stood perfectly still while I clipped it to his collar, as if he understood this was how we went out together. The front steps were slick, and the sidewalk in Minneapolis had that thin layer of ice you don't see until you're already on it. He trotted out like the world was his, skidded, legs splayed in 4 different directions, and stared back at me, offended that the ground had betrayed him. I grumbled something about, "Watch your feet," but I heard the almost laugh in my own voice, and it startled me more than his clumsy dance. A neighbor across the street paused with her trash can halfway to the curb. "New roommate?" she called, eyeing the white puppy who was now trying to eat a snowbank. "Just temporary," I said, which sounded less convincing out loud than it had in my head. She smiled anyway, the kind of smile people give you when they know you're lying to yourself in a harmless way. As he sniffed the air and tangled the leash around my ankle, I noticed her glance at the small metal tag on his collar. "Those folks work with a lot of northern dogs," she added, nodding toward the tag. "Good people." That night, after he'd finally settled, I sat at the kitchen table with the crumpled note from the box. I read it once, twice, tracing the shaky letters, squinting at the faint initials at the bottom that tugged at some far corner of memory. "Eyes aren't what they used to be," I muttered, folding it back up. On the couch, the puppy sprawled out, one paw reaching until it landed on my knee like it belonged there. I realized it had been a very long time since anyone had touched me without thinking about how fragile I was. My gaze drifted to the tiny rescue emblem on his collar, catching the light. "I'm just going to find out who you people are," I told him, more to myself than to him. And for the first time in years, the idea of walking into a new place didn't feel quite as impossible. I walked into the shelter thinking I was here for information. They looked at me like I was the one up for adoption. The place smelled like disinfectant and nervous breathing. Down the hallway, I could hear a chorus of barks, that sharp echo you only get from concrete and chain link. Posters of dogs before and after lined the walls, smiling faces taped over scared eyes. I held the leash a little tighter. The white shepherd puppy walked at my side, ears flicking, nails clicking on the tile. When someone laughed too loud in the corridor, he startled, then stepped sideways just enough to put his narrow body between me and the sound. Not much of a shield, but the thought counted. A young woman came out from behind the desk, a lanyard around her neck and a badge that read, "Iris." She had tired eyes that were still kind when they landed on the puppy, then on my hand gripping the leash, then on the cane in the other. "How are you managing such an active little guy?" she asked. "Especially at your age." I could feel the checklist running behind her eyes. Cane, lines on my face, the faint wheeze in my chest from walking across the parking lot. "I've delivered mail in blizzards for 30 years, I said. "I can handle one pup." She smiled at that, but it was a careful smile. She knelt to scratch his neck, fingers brushing the small tag on his collar. "He came down from a little town just over the Canadian border," she said. "We call them our North Dogs. They do well with Minnesota winters." The puppy leaned into her hand, then stepped back so his shoulder brushed my leg again. I felt the touch more than I expected to. "So why my porch?" I asked. Iris straightened, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "Someone in our network said there was a man on that street who never turned away a dog," she said softly. "They said you'd know what to do." She let that hang there for a second, then glanced down at the puppy. "What's his name?" I cleared my throat. "Haven't given him one yet," I admitted. "Didn't want to make any promises I couldn't keep." She nodded like she understood more than I'd said out loud and walked us toward the lobby. On the way out, a wall of little brass plates caught my eye, donor names engraved in neat rows. Halfway down the middle column, my last name stared back at me, paired with a first name I hadn't spoken in years. I pretended I hadn't seen it and pushed the door open. Outside on the walk back, the puppy walked closer than before, his side bumping my leg with every few steps, like he'd also read something on that wall. And for the first time, It crossed my mind that maybe I hadn't found him at all. Maybe he'd been sent to find me. You don't really know a dog until you've tried to bathe him in a too small bathroom. A few days after the shelter, I decided the white shepherd puppy and my house both smelled a little too much like yesterday. So we marched down the hallway to the bathroom, me with my cane and him with his suspicious ears tilted back. The room was barely big enough for one old man and a sink. Add a nervous puppy, and it felt like rush hour. I spread an old faded rug on the tile so at least one of us might not break a hip. He watched the tub fill, head cocked, backing up every time the water hit the porcelain a little too loud. When I lifted him in, he tried to climb right back out, paws scrabbling, leaving wet streaks and panicked little prints everywhere. I muttered about 4 left feet and no respect for indoor plumbing, but you could hear the smile leaking through. The cheap shampoo smelled like fake flowers and hospital soap. The white tile, the steam, the echo of running water pulled me sideways in time before I could stop it. I saw her there again, thin fingers gripping my wrist while I kept her steady under the spray, both of us pretending it was just another Tuesday and not one of the last. The puppy's shoulder slammed into my chest and snapped me back. For a moment he thrashed, then suddenly he just stopped. He leaned his full wet weight against me, heavy and shaking, trusting me to hold him in that slippery little world. I sat down on the edge of the tub because my knees insisted, one arm around him, the other bracing us both. His heart hammered against my ribs, and somewhere under the sound of the water, I realized I was crying, quiet and messy, the way you do when you've run out of people to be brave for. When it was over, I wrapped him in an old towel, and he stood there dripping, smelling like soap and second chances. He followed me through the house, still damp, leaving little damp prints on the floor, then curled up at the base of my chair as if that was where he'd always belonged. He didn't jump or beg or demand anything. He just was there. I watched his chest rise and fall, watched one ear twitch in his sleep, and heard my own voice come out softer than I meant it to. If you're staying, you're going to need a name. And I sat there with that thought hanging in the air, not quite ready to say the rest out loud. I'd named mail routes and pickup trucks, but naming a German Shepherd puppy felt like a bigger commitment. Morning light came in thin and cold through the living room window, the kind that makes dust look like slow snow. Before I could pretend to ignore it, 2 paws landed on the arm of my chair, and a wet nose pressed into my wrist. He didn't bark or whine. He just stared at me with that quiet insistence that says, "We do this now." I used to plan my days around news channels and reruns. Now it was his bladder and his breakfast telling me what came next. I shrugged into my coat while he bounced at the door, white tail brushing the frame, leash already a promise hanging from my hand. Outside, Minneapolis was all frozen sidewalks and tired trees. We walked our little loop, my cane tapping time, his nails clicking counterpoint. I tried a few names on the air just to hear how they sounded. Buddy. Nothing. Chief. He sniffed a mailbox. Roscoe. He yawned. There was a character I loved once in an old book I read on long winter routes, a quiet man who saw more than he ever said. The name surfaced from somewhere under the pile of years. Marlow, I said. The puppy stopped. He lifted his head and looked straight at me. Ears high, eyes sharp like I'd finally guessed the right answer on a test I didn't know I was taking. His tail gave one slow, certain sweep. Yeah, I said. Marlow. At home, Marlo learned sit by the stove and wait while steam rose off his food. He'd quiver, eyes bouncing between the bowl and my hand, but he'd hold himself there until I nodded. One afternoon, he padded off and came back carrying an old slipper I'd forgotten under the bed. He didn't chew it. He just held it, careful, like it was part of me he wanted to keep close. That same week, the clinic left a message about blood work and blood pressure and how I needed to take it easy, mister. I listened with the phone pressed to my ear, watching Marlo nose his ball toward my foot, ready for me to send it across the room again. I didn't mention him when I called back. Didn't say a word about the growing, stubborn heart on 4 legs sharing my house. That night, another call buzzed through, a reminder about my upcoming visit. After I hung up, I looked down at Marlo sleeping curled against my chair, white fur rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. They don't know about you yet, kid, I said, feeling the words tug in my chest, and I'm not sure how they'll take it. The night the lights went out, I realized I wasn't afraid of the dark anymore. I was afraid of losing the warmth next to my chair. The storm rolled into Minneapolis like it had a score to settle. Wind howled down the street, snow slapped against the windows, and somewhere far off a siren kept rising and falling like a bad memory I couldn't place. The house flickered once, twice, and then the lights gave up. The furnace sighed and went quiet. I pulled on an extra sweater, then another, and lowered myself into my old chair by the window. Marlo paced the living room at first, nails clicking, white shepherd coat ghostly in the dim light, ears twitching at every sound the house made, learning to be silent. When the dark really settled, he stopped circling and slid in against my side, tucking his legs under himself until he was pressed along my hip like a breathing hot water bottle. Sitting there with his weight against me, I could almost smell wood smoke instead of cold drywall. I slipped back to a different winter, a different house, everyone crowded around a black iron stove. Kids laughing, my mother humming, my father poking the fire, and a big old shepherd snoring at our feet like he owned the floor. Back then, the storm outside just made the inside feel fuller. Now it was just me and Marlo. Only it didn't feel empty in the same way anymore. You know, I said into the dark, voice rougher than the wind outside, I haven't spoken to my daughter in years. The word hung there like frost. Stupid fight. No one even remembers what started it, probably, except me. Marlo let out a soft sigh and shifted, then lifted his head and set his chin right on my chest, heavy and certain, like he'd been listening the whole time. I put a hand on his back and left it there until the power hummed back to life and the house blinked awake. When the lights steadied, I pushed myself up, went to the drawer by the phone, and pulled out a worn scrap of paper with her number on it. My fingers dialed slow, muscle memory fighting pride. The ring never had a chance to start. Marlo stepped forward and bumped my hand with his nose. Not hard, just enough to knock my thumb off the last digit. The phone slipped from my fingers and landed back in its cradle like it had changed its mind. I looked at him, at those steady eyes, and a laugh broke out of me with a tear right behind it. All right, I said, running my hand along his neck. Maybe not today, but not never. My heart didn't ask for permission before it stuttered. Marlo didn't ask before he stayed. It was just another midday walk on our usual route, the kind I could do with my eyes half closed. Same cracked sidewalk, same bare trees, same mailbox he insisted on sniffing every time like it might have changed overnight. The white shepherd puppy trotted ahead on the leash, tail loose, checking back every few steps to make sure I was where I always was. Halfway to the corner, the world tilted. Not much at first, just a little sway, like the ground took a breath under my shoes. I told myself it was nothing, that I just needed a second, but the second didn't help. I aimed for the park bench like it was home base. Just a minute, I told him, lowering myself down slower than I liked. The pounding in my chest wasn't the good kind you get from laughing. Marlo stopped pulling. He moved in close, closer than usual, white fur brushing my knee, those dark eyes climbing my face like they were reading a weather report only he could see. Easy, I muttered, though I wasn't sure which of us I was talking to. Then the bench seemed to slide away from me, or maybe I slid off it. My cane clattered to the ground. The sky opened up overhead too bright, and the edges of everything went soft. Marlo's bark cut through it, sharp and steady. Not panicked, not wild, just a rhythm. Here, look here, something's wrong here. I felt the tug and release of the leash as he moved, heard his claws scraping on the path as he stepped around me, barking toward the street. A voice broke in, close and worried. Walter, you all right? Hands were on my shoulder, my arm, the world turning back into shapes I knew. Our neighbor, face creased with concern, phone already in his hand. He just went down, I heard him say. Yeah, I'm calling now. And hey, this dog's got a rescue tag. Yeah, on his collar. There was talking about protocols, about not leaving a German shepherd puppy alone. By the time the ambulance doors opened, Marlo had stopped barking and was standing so close his chest touched my arm, as if he could hold me in place by will alone. I can't leave him, I tried to tell the EMTs when they lifted me onto the gurney. He's just getting used to the house. He won't understand. Someone slipped an oxygen mask over my face, words muffled by plastic and beeping. They talked about taking him back to the shelter for now, just until things settled, like you can put a heart and a dog on the same shelf and hope they don't fall. The last clear image I had before the doors closed was Marlow at the back of the ambulance bay, held by a rescue worker, white fur bright against their dark jacket. He was staring straight at me, ears forward, eyes locked like he was trying to memorize my face before they pulled him away. I watched him through the narrowing gap as the doors swung shut. I'd outlived my dogs before. I wasn't going to let this be another one. Hospitals and shelters have the same smell if you stay long enough. Disinfectant and waiting. My room had white walls, a humming machine beside the bed, and that sharp, clean odor that never quite covers the fear underneath. Nurses came and went, checking screens, checking charts, checking if I was still worth checking on. One of the doctors stood at the foot of my bed, looking over his glasses like I was a math problem. "With your age and your heart," he said, "a big dog might be too much to manage at home. You might want to consider placing him with a family who can keep up." I stared past him at the ceiling and saw bars instead. Not prison bars, kennel bars. A white shepherd puppy sitting on cold concrete, head down, ears back, wondering why the man who smelled like home had vanished. I could almost feel the weight of him against my leg from that very first night. The doctor kept talking about liability and falls and what ifs. All I could hear was the echo of those same words aimed at people like me when they talk about nursing homes. Too much risk, too much work, too complicated to keep. After my wife died, I made a career out of not asking anyone for anything. I shut the door, let the phone ring, told myself silence was strength. All it did was push my family to the far edges of my life until we were just names on each other's mail. Lying there with wires on my chest, I knew I didn't want to do that again. Not with Marlo, not with anyone. A few days in, I heard it before I saw it. Claws on tile in the hallway, a quick, hopeful bark that cut straight through the antiseptic air. The door opened, and there he was, tail thumping, ears high, white coat bright against the dull hospital green. Iris stood behind him, holding the leash, a visitor badge clipped next to her shelter tag. "Therapy visit from the rescue," she said, almost too casual. Marlo didn't wait for permission. He pulled forward, shoved his head under my hand, then climbed as close as the bed rails allowed, chest pressed to my side. The monitor by my head beeped a little faster, and the nurse in the doorway smiled. "Best medicine we've got," she said. As I smoothed the fur between his ears, my eyes drifted to Iris's badge. The last name printed there matched the one on my own chart. She noticed where I was looking, and, for the first time since I'd met her, she looked away. I always thought my stubbornness built a wall. Turned out, it built a bridge I just hadn't walked across yet. The day after that therapy visit, the room finally went quiet. The nurse finished her checks, the doctor finished his speech about next steps, and the door clicked shut behind them. It was just me, Iris, and Marlo stretched along the side of the bed like he'd grown there. I stared at her badge again, at my last name printed under her first. "You want to tell me why we match?" I asked. She took a breath like she was about to jump into cold water. "Because I'm not just from the shelter," she said. "I'm your granddaughter." The word hit harder than any medication they'd hooked me up to. "Your mom," she added quietly, saying my daughter's name, the one I hadn't spoken out loud in longer than I cared to measure. "She's my mom." Marlo shifted, lifting his head, eyes moving between us like he was following every word. I put my hand on his neck just to keep from reaching for anything else. "I heard about you before I ever came to the rescue," Iris went on. "Guy who never turned away a dog, who'd drive back on his route if he saw one out in the cold. But I only knew that version from stories." She looked at me then, really looked. When someone mentioned an older man on that street, alone, who still kept a dog bowl by the door, I put it together. I knew it was you. "So you dropped a puppy on my porch," I said, the corners of my mouth betraying me. She actually laughed a little. "I knew you wouldn't open the door for me," she said. "But for a dog, that's the one language you always understood." She told me how she and a couple of coworkers chose Marlo, the quiet north dog with the watchful eyes, and drove him over on a gray morning. How she sat in the truck around the corner and watched from the mirror until she saw me open the door, saw white fur and old hands in the same frame again. While she talked, Marlo pressed his head into my palm, then turned and nudged her elbow, back and forth like he was passing a confession between us. I don't know who he was comforting more. Later, when the doctor came back with a social worker in tow, they found a different room. I was sitting up higher, asking questions, one hand still resting on Marlo's back. They talked less about finding him another home and more about rails in the bathroom, about home health visits, about what it would take to keep us together. They mentioned a facility just once, like they were testing the word. Then they offered the alternative. My own house, with help, with follow-up, with conditions. I looked at Iris. I looked at Marlo, watching my face like the verdict was his whole world. If I go home, I said, voice steady for the first time in days, he goes home. That's the deal. Coming home used to mean turning on the TV for noise. Now it meant the sound of paws on old hardwood floors. They wheeled me in with a tote bag full of pill bottles and a stack of papers about limitations and activity levels. A nurse showed me where to put the chart on the fridge, when to take what, who would be stopping by to check on me a couple times a week. Through it all, Marlo stayed at my side. A white shepherd coat pressed against my leg, like he was making sure I made it all the way back in. Officially, he was just my dog. Unofficially, everyone treated him like a prescription that didn't fit in their computers. Emotional support, they wrote on one form, as if I hadn't known that from the day he walked through my door in a cardboard box. Days settled into a new kind of routine. A home health nurse would tap on the door, step over a squeaky toy, and let Marlo sniff her hand before she took my blood pressure. He'd watch every move, then relax only when she packed up and said, "See you next week." Iris started coming by more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with two little shadows behind her. The kids learned quick to move slow around my bad knee and to be gentle with Marlo's ears. They'd sit on the floor and feed him treats from open palms, while I told stories they'd never heard about mail routes and snowstorms, and the first dog I ever loved. We walked the neighborhood again, me with my cane, Marlo matching my pace like he'd been studying it. No more pulling, no more tangling the leash. He checked in with a glance every few steps. Neighbors waved from porches, called out hello, handed over biscuits for the guy with the big ears, and I had to ask which one they meant. He didn't just belong to me anymore. On warm afternoons, if you can call them that in Minneapolis, we'd sit on the bench near the corner. Marlo would wander a few feet to where an old veteran from down the block sat staring at nothing in particular. He'd rest his head on the man's knee until those distant eyes came back into focus, and a small, surprised smile appeared. Watching that, I realized this house wasn't just my quiet place to wait out the clock anymore. It was Marlo's home base, Iris's safe stop, a spot on the map where people knew they could knock and be met by one old man and one white shepherd who were still trying. One evening, under the soft kitchen light, I sat with a cup of tea gone cold, Marlo at my feet, his breathing steady and sure. I looked where the camera would be if there was one, and spoke into the quiet. You probably think this is just an old man and his dog story. I let that sit for a beat. It's not. It's about what happens when you stop giving up on living things, including yourself. I was supposed to be the one giving this dog a second chance. Somewhere along the way, he gave me mine. When that white German Shepherd puppy Marlo showed up in a damp box on my front step, the world had more or less decided we were both used up. Me, too old and too broken down. Him, just another extra mouth somebody couldn't keep. But feeding him, walking him down those icy Minneapolis sidewalks, wrestling him into the bathtub, sitting through that winter storm and that hospital stay, somewhere in all of that, we stopped being a lonely old man and a stray. We became a family. A small one, sure. But enough. This isn't a story about feeling sorry for old folks or abandoned dogs. It's about what a single rescued pup can do when he's given a chance to do what dogs do best. Show up, stay close, and quietly refuse to let you quit on yourself. He got me to open the door again. First for him, then for Iris, then for the rest of the world I'd shut out. This little guy's journey from abandonment to rehabilitation shows how important nonprofit rescue groups really are. A little local outfit willing to take in North dogs didn't just save Marlo. They brought him to my porch, and in doing that, they stitched together 3 generations of my family. Caring for a rescued puppy is more than love. It's responsibility. It's pet care. It's pills on the counter and leashes by the door, slow walks and clean water, and showing up even on the days your body says, stay in the chair. If you're my age or somewhere close, hear this. As long as you can lift a hand to stroke a dog's fur, you are still needed. By a dog like Marlo, by someone in your family, by the part of you that still wants to be alive, not just breathing. And if you're younger, remember this. Sometimes it's easier to bring someone a puppy than to say, I miss you. Do both. Visit your parents. Call your grandparents. Don't write them off before life does. If this story nudged something in you, share it. Maybe it will send one more person to a shelter or convince someone to keep their old dog one more year or push a shaking thumb to finally dial a long forgotten number. Join our Brave Paws family. Be their voice. Be their hope.